You know, if you just joined us, you're listening to the Accelerated Wealth Show. We're talking to Paige Stover-Hague about unconventional assets and collectibles, things that make life fun that maybe you've been collecting, or maybe your father or your mother has collected, and someday you're going to inherit those things, or you're going to pass those things on to your kids. And we're talking about how fun and wonderful these things can be, but there can be some real challenges when it comes to estate planning in passing these things to the next generation.
So, Paige, as an attorney who specializes in dealing with unconventional assets, I'm sure you've seen a ton of different situations where, the kids are going to inherit a huge collection, maybe even some of it going to the grandkids. So discuss your theory about the kids are going to love it just like dad or granddad did.
Well, the issue, Doug, is most of the times the kids really don't want the stuff.
Yeah.
They understand that this collection meant everything to their parents, but all they want is the cash.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now, first of all, the parents are devastated because they were hoping, that their kids would also acquire the passion, but that rarely happens. Now, sometimes the gene for collecting will pass to the next generation, but usually they're not interested in collecting the same thing that their parents collected.
So, Paige, how do you then bridge that gap between the passion of collecting and passing it on or inheriting these things, and where you've talked about some of the problems that you could run into? Something could be worth a lot of money. Most financial advisors are not aware of these types of things. Most attorneys miss it as well. How do you bridge that divide?
Exactly. Well, the first thing we have to do is raise awareness. So it has kind of become, my personal mission to write these books. I'm in the middle of another book right now on this topic to help the advisory community understand that they need to ask the questions. The collectors also have a responsibility to share with their advisory team the fact that they have this collection or these horses or this garage full of cars, and we need to have a conversation about what's going to happen to these. So the first thing we as the advisory team need to do is have good communication with the collector themselves to determine their intentions.
That's huge.
Because there's a couple of options. If the kids don't want it, and we're going to do a liquidation strategy, there are some requirements, some details we need to pay attention to liquidate. Another option is the collector might want to give this to a museum. So now we have a charitable strategy we need to put in place.
I want to hold through the break because I want to come back with what these options are and how we do that. Just got to run to a break. You're listening to Accelerated Wealth. I'm Chris Abeyta with your co-host Doug Berkey. We've got Paige Stover-Hague today. We're talking about non-traditional assets that you might inherit or pass on. And we'll be back in just a second on AM 740 KVOR.
Let's go back to Doug Berkey and Chris Abeyta for more about your financial future with Accelerated Wealth.
AM 740 KVOR. You're listening to the Accelerated Wealth Show with Chris Abeyta, your host and co-host Doug Berkey. We've got Paige Stover-Hague. She is a practicing estate planning attorney specializing in unconventional assets. Paige, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, as people have collectibles, things that they love, they can create some real challenges when you're inheriting those things from your parents or from somebody else, or when you're passing those on. And there's some things people don't know. Do you have any stories or any kind of horror stories where something very, very rare, very, very valuable was passed on and it created a really difficult or taxation or nightmare of a situation?
Well, there's actually a couple of ways things can go horribly wrong. Probably the most dramatic example is when, let's say a piece of art was owned by your great-grandparents. At the time of the death of the great-grandparent, the family just went in and all of a sudden started removing things from the walls. So a couple of days later, there were a lot of shadows in the wallpaper and the paint, and all of a sudden art had transferred into the homes of the grandparents. The same thing happened when the grandparents died, and now the parents have all the art, and the transfers have never been reported. Well, the shocking thing here is that the statute of limitations never runs on tax fraud. So there were 2 generations of taxable events that have transpired. No taxes have been paid, and the penalties have accrued all this time. So now the children have the collection. The IRS has discovered that all this has gone on, and now you are in a nightmare of a situation.
You know, first off, this boils my blood. Why should the IRS have anything to do with this, number one? I mean, this is like, who gets the silverware, right? You know,
well, but still, depending...
And who wants the armchair?
It has to be valued as part of the estate, you know, assuming we're talking a major collection where you do have a taxable estate. You know, if it's under the estate tax limit, then you're right, the IRS doesn't care.
How do you avoid this? Or if somebody's in this situation, you know, what do they do?
Well, the most obvious thing is to first of all have an inventory of the property.
Okay.
This is something we pay a lot of attention to when we're working with a client, because almost no matter how much these collectors love and have these incredible passions for their collection, they're usually not very good at record keeping at all. So we spend a lot of time on getting the inventory together. Then, at the time of the probate, you're already ready. You have the inventory pulled together, and the probate attorney then is very aware of what's in the estate and what we need to do when we're preparing the probate inventory. So now all of these items are included, and you don't have the quote-unquote tax fraud issue going from generation to generation. So basically the bottom line is it needs to be reported every time the wealth is transferred intergenerationally.
So, yeah, in recapping, if you're in a situation and there are family heirlooms that are very, very valuable, whether you're passing those down or maybe you are going to receive them, you know that you may receive them from your parents or grandparents. Really important to categorize these, get these valued, because you don't want to be committing, unknowingly committing tax fraud that could really mess you up. I would imagine, too, Paige, that there are situations where somebody inherits something, not realizing how valuable it is, or maybe they do, and they want to then liquidate it or sell it, but there's a whole different taxation situation, and they end up finding themselves in trouble because of how much they've inherited and what they have to liquidate to be able to just pay the taxes.
Well, you're exactly right. And this is another point that we try to emphasize when we're at the planning stage, is often collectors will just say, oh, I don't want to deal with this, I'll just let my kids sort it out. Well, the problem there is if you're leaving tangible personal property, and it is very, very valuable, the kids will end up, the estate will have to pay the taxes. What ends up happening is that the collection has to be sold at fire sale pricing just to pay the estate tax liability. So the collection gets distributed all over the place. It doesn't retain its value as a collection just so the taxes can be paid. Well, that is not a good solution for most collectors. They cringe when they hear this.
Wow.
So we try to spend a lot of time on the front end doing good planning during the lifetime of the collector to avoid these horrible situations.